Today we'll be talking about diets for exercise, touching on macronutrients needed for exercise, meal frequency, some guidelines for pre-event meals and eating around exercise, and a little bit of a discussion on glycemic index. So when we take a look at an athlete's diet, we can see that when we look at an endurance athlete especially, the majority of calories should come from carbohydrate, and most of the carbs should be from nutrient-dense whole grains, fruits, vegetables, and low-fat dairy products. We also have dietary fat that's essential for health. We really need to make sure we're getting those omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids, even though the body fat stores contain enough energy to fuel endurance events. So we want to make sure that we're having really heart-healthy monounsaturated fats from things like avocado and olive oil, as well as some polyunsaturated fats with a real focus on omega-3 fatty acids, since in the US we tend to have a little too much omega-6 and not quite enough omega-3. And omega-3 sources are going to be mostly from fish oil, as well as flaxseed, walnuts, canola oil as well. And then we can see that the protein needs of the athlete can be met with plant or animal sources. And there are lots of examples of athletes who are quite muscular, who lead fully plant-based diets. So, with a little bit of time and attention, a variety of different types of diets can be implemented that have plant sources as well as animal sources. Now, when we look at strength athletes, we might see a little bit of a shift in the carb, fat, and protein just because the energy needs aren't quite as high in athletes that are doing more exercise that requires a little bit higher ATP, creatine phosphate shuttle, sort of intense exercise, rather than, our marathoner who's going to be utilizing a ton of carbohydrate throughout his or her exercise regimen. When we look at pre, during, and post-exercise guidelines, we can see that, you should always begin the exercise well hydrated by consuming lots of fluid in the 24 hours prior to exercise, as well as 2 cups of fluid before exercise. During exercise, you want to make sure that you're consuming at least 6 to 12 ounces of fluid every 15 to 20 minutes. And plain water is okay, but when we look at exercise lasting longer than 60 minutes, that's when we want to start thinking about fueling with carbohydrate as well as electrolyte in addition to water. So in terms of the amount of electrolyte lost in sweat at that point, as well as the body, after that hour is going to be that in that post-absorptive and fasted state, we need to make sure that we're providing some exogenous carbohydrate as well as, utilizing the what's left of the muscle glycogen at that point in order to fuel the long endurance activity. And then after exercise, we want to make sure we're beginning fuel replacement immediately. So with fluid, that's going to be 16 to 24 ounces of fluid for each pound of weight lost. And the major recommendation is to make sure that post-exercise, you're incorporating some sort of carbohydrate and protein in a ratio of 3 or 4 to 1 carbs to protein in order to make sure you're replenishing muscle glycogen stores and repairing damaged muscle for protein synthesis. So as I mentioned in the last session, I talked a little bit about carbohydrate supplementation or supercompensation, and this is typically done prior to a long endurance activity where you're really trying to perform well. So running a marathon is a great example of one of those activities that a lot of people do perform. So a classical regimen is 2 sessions of very intense exercise, followed by 2 days of very low carbohydrate, and then 3 days of very high carbohydrate diet with rest. And then that tends to really make people not feel so great, and make people feel a little bit bloated prior to the physical activity. And it feels a little stressful for some people to have that very low carb diet just a few days before an event because the physical symptoms don't feel great. followed by the bloating that comes from increased muscle glycogen. So a modified regimen would be exercise tapered over 5 days with 1 day of rest, with 3 days, the last 3 days of 50% carbohydrate diet, so a little bit lower, and then 3 days prior to the race, 70% carbohydrate diet. So that's just kind of shifting, your carbohydrate diet tiny bit lower and tiny bit higher. And that modified regimen can be really great for somebody who gets a little stressed before, a long-term event and wants to make sure that they're performing at their maximum. So in addition to nutrition, a lot of people use some ergogenic aids in order to support their performance. So some of these could be amino acids, so arginine, ornithine, aspartate salts, or branched chain amino acids, or BCAAs. BCAAs we'll be actually doing a review of when we talk about protein in the protein chapter. You all will be, watching some documentaries and taking a look at, the literature around BCAAs and deciding if they're worth the money. So we'll get into that a little bit more, but, the thought is that BCAAs can be used for gluconeogenesis and be used for energy. And so the goal is to have them as a supplemental form in addition to the carbohydrate that we're consuming as another source of energy. But the jury's kind of out on whether or not they work. Antioxidants, can be used, vitamins A, C, and E, as well as a lot of phytochemicals have been shown to possibly reduce some of the negative effects of inflammation that happen post-exercise. So, you've probably seen some of the hype on beet juice or cherry juice or those sorts of things post-exercise or pre-exercise, and effects on performance. Again, this is kind of newer research, but like BCAAs, antioxidants can't hurt and do provide a very nutrient-dense source of carbohydrate before, during, and after exercise. So there's no harm in that. And when we look at, the difference between our overall healthy diet, ergogenic supplements, and sports food and beverages, the great thing about something like amino acids and antioxidants is we can get them from real food. And so if we're focusing first on real food and then thinking about, okay, is digestibility or something like that a factor, or am I at the level where some ergogenic aids that are legal might be able to improve my performance, then I might be thinking about that, right? So for example, I know a few people in this class are distance runners, so perhaps, a whole foods choice, like eating a banana during a marathon, might not be doable. So perhaps you use some sport food or beverage in order to enhance that, right? That might be the purpose of the sports foods and beverages, but often people use them as, just some sort of be all end all of, that's what I'm supposed to eat or drink around exercise. Taking a look at, the biochemical properties of something like Gatorade, you could make your own with, sugar and some salt and some potassium. But, you might choose to have that store-bought form just with the understanding of, what that is, what's in there, and, that you could create your own using some real food. And so the last thing I want to talk about today is some of the different ergogenic supplements. So one example of a performance enhancer would be anabolic steroids. So as you can see, anabolic steroids can act similarly to testosterone, acting on the hypothalamus to stimulate that anterior pituitary gland to cause the cells in the testes to stimulate testosterone production. So you can see that high levels of testosterone and high levels of anabolic steroids are going to inhibit hormone release, thus increasing overall strength, performance, and muscle gain. We also see that creatine, we've talked about the creatine phosphate shuttle. So we can see that creatine, it's synthesized in the body, but we can also consume it from the diet or from supplements that can cause us to increase the amount of creatine the muscle, stimulating that immediate energy or recovery when we look at, the creatine phosphate shuttle. So in sports where you want to have a good amount of substrate in order to perform those 1 rep maxes of deadlifts, as I had given the example before, creatine can be a helpful way to do that in order to cause us to have a little bit more energy on reserve and recovery from exercise in order to perform some of those strength type exercises. And then we also have, some other illegal forms of substances such as EPO, or blood doping, where you would actually put increased blood into the body. So when we look at low blood oxygen levels, what you can see is low blood oxygen levels will decrease the delivery to kidneys and to other tissues. Kidneys can detect low oxygen levels and release EPO into the bloodstream. And then when you administer that EPO, then that is going to stimulate the bone marrow to produce more red blood cells and release them into the bloodstream. So that can act as, a healer, when you have diseased kidneys, but can also act as a performance enhancer that, of course, is illegal and, can be substance abuse and, is something that drug testers will test for, especially in the endurance type sports. So when we're looking at, the use of some of these different things, something like creatine might be really helpful for some sort of strength athlete, or in a sport where power and things like that are hyped, right? And then, something like EPO might be used in a sport where somebody needs high levels of oxygen-rich blood in order to create more aerobic metabolism. However, when we look at, the pros and cons of some of these things, creatine is deemed pretty safe to use, but things like our anabolic steroids as well as EPO are going to have some really negative side effects that can lead to long-term negative health outcomes. So, looking at this take-home message, an overall healthy diet comes first, then some sports foods and beverages might be helpful for some people. And ergogenic supplements are not, just free increased performance. They're always going to probably come with a cost. So just make sure that you're weighing the costs and benefits of ergogenic supplements. And if you're, a registered dietitian working with people who are taking ergogenic supplements, that you make sure that they understand the risks and the benefits of taking those different aids.